these patterns have in common? We have a family, we have a youth gang, a flock of birds, a juvenile justice system, and youth in India. What do those have in common? Well, it is incredibly complex and incredibly simple. They are simple rules and systemic patterns. So in all of these cases, what we have are individuals following simple rules in local conditions, and over a group of agents, over time, over space, we have emergent patterns that come out from the whole that are greater than the sum of the parts. Rules, conditions, patterns. Now this flock of birds, I love the description that Updike gives. It's a scarf of birds. Comes because each of the birds knows the rules, knows its local place, and does exactly what it's supposed to do. Now, scholars disagree about whether or not human beings follow simple rules, because we have free will, you know. But we believe that it's helpful to think of human beings having simple rules, so that if we think about this flock of birds, the rules that a computer simulation model would use to represent these birds, the first rule is fly toward the center, match the speed of your neighbor, and don't bump into anybody. Now, these are also the rules they use to simulate traffic on a highway, by the way. But if you all stood up right now and followed these rules, you would flock like birds. And in that orderly, disorderly path, you'd end up getting somewhere together. Now, what if we think about peace as such a pattern? Individuals following simple rules under local conditions. What would that tell us about conflict? And what if we thought about conflict as a pattern that emerges, individuals following simple rules under local conditions? What would that tell us about peace? Well, I think that it would help us know why our interventions work so often, and when they work, why they don't work. So what I'd like to do is just to share some examples of simple rules with you. First one is about a gang, a street gang. Now, we were invited to do a research project with the juvenile justice system in Tennessee, and the question was, why do these young men join these communities of violence and crime? And so we looked for simple rules, and these were the ones we found. Control or be controlled. Protect your brothers. Defend your territory. Sound like interesting rules? What shocked us when we started to write our paper was we realized these are the same rules that cover performance in civil society. Think of a union. Think of a corporation. A faith community. They're following these same rules. So why is it that we get such aberrant behavior out of these rules in a street gang? Well, what we realized that it is what complexity folks call initial conditions. And anthropologists call it culture. Some systems groups call it context. It's about the conditions that exist in which the rules play themselves out. Same set of rules, different set of conditions, different set of emerging patterns. So if you want to use the simple rules to shift the way that an emergent pattern works, one of the things you can do is change the conditions. But that doesn't surprise peacemakers, because you understand that much of what you do in your interventions is to shift conditions. The surprise that it does give is that you can think about the same intervention into the different set of rules is going to give you a different outcome. So it may very well be that you do one thing in one place and it works, but you go to another place where the simple rules are different and it's not going to work. So you can't use conditions themselves to predict. In fact, you can't predict at all. But if you are aware of the rules and can shift them, sometimes a different pattern can emerge. But what if you don't have the power or the position or the time to influence the conditions? Then what can you do? Well, one of the things you can do is to reinterpret the rules. If you reinterpret the rules, what you do is to say, let's just shift them a little bit. So this was used in a settlement house in South LA to work with a street gang. And what they found was that if they took that rule protect your brothers, and they redefined brothers as biological siblings and not gang brothers. And if they said to teenagers in the community, come to the house, we'll feed you, we'll let you play games, we'll show you what to do, we'll teach you things, you can bring your little brothers with you, and they can participate. The only rules are, if you bring your little brother, you can come. No gang violence, and you have to come with your brothers. And so what they built in that space with those simple rules, not changing the rules but reinterpreting them, was a zone of peace in that violent community. They reinterpreted the rules. Now sometimes you can also change the rules explicitly. There's a particular example in Delhi. There was a youth development group that wanted to help young people move into leadership in their communities. And so they went into the community and they discovered one of their simple rules was, remember who you are. And this was a lovely rule in a tradition-based, structured community. And these youth remembered who they were. But they realized that that rule was not so helpful for youth who needed to go into leadership and be innovative in a social and cultural sense. And so they shifted the rule very slightly and said, discover who you are. Not remember who you are, discover who you are. And they helped those youth think about discovering who they were. And the shifts were remarkable in the work that they came to. Because one of the things they discovered was that the traditions were important to them. And so being a part of their families and remembering who they were was an important part of who they were. But when they discovered who they were, they could also work in empathy and creativity in a community to make a change. So you can change the rule, you can change the condition, you can change the interpretation of the rule. And there's yet a third thing that you can do, and that is to build a dialogue using the simple rules. So you can go about the process of entering into dialogue with the ideas in the context. So this is what they did in Delhi. They didn't make up the rules and then just deliver them to someone. They brought the youth together to discuss what are the rules that drive their decisions, what are the patterns that they see, and what are the behaviors that mediate. So this is the important thing about the simple rules. They give you a link between individual behaviors and systemic patterns, or a link between a systemic pattern and an individual behavior. And if people can discuss those in a sensitive and shared perspective, they can come to own those rules together. So there's one more project that we're working on currently, and it is with corruption in courts in a sub-Saharan nation. Now, nobody disagrees that corruption is a pattern, right? The question is, what do you do about it? No one knows what to do about massive corruption. So what our job we've been given is to see if we can figure out what are the rules, the simple rules, that drive corruption in the courts so that we can begin to see what might happen. So after 200 interviews, these are the rules that we've seen. Fend for your own, no matter what. Acquiesce to power. Punish deviation and expect to be punished. Take as much as you can, as soon as you can, and uphold the formalities of the law. Now, if you think about these rules, you can imagine how they would have been success criteria in decades of civil war. You know how these rules would have emerged, right? But you can also see the ways that they would be the roots of corruption. What was survival is now corruption. So what would you do to shift these rules? Would you change the conditions by reorganizing the courts? Would you shift the interpretation of the rules by looking at this relationship between the formality and the substance of the law? Would you change the rule just a little bit to make it acknowledge but not acquiesce to power? What would you do? Would you take these rules into the community and ask people if this creates for them the experience, the behaviors, and the patterns they want, or can they choose something else? What would you do to make this shift? Would you, as we say, think about the patterns, think about the perspectives, think about the paths that you might take to influence those simple rules? Thank you. Thanks, Peter.